We're ready to begin the next session. Masala Shakespeare, the Worlds of Shakespeare and Indian Cinema, an illustrated lecture by Jonathan Gill Harris. Jonathan Gill Harris is Professor of English at Ashoka University, the author of the best-selling book, The First Firangis. His articles on Shakespeare and Hindi cinema have been published in the Hindustan Times, The Hindu, and The Week. And these form the basis of his latest book, Masala Shakespeare, How the Bard Became Indian, which considers the often unexpected convergences between Shakespeare's drama and Indian storytelling, performance, and entertainment traditions. A warm welcome to Jonathan Gill Harris, Masala Shakespeare, the Worlds of Shakespeare in Indian Cinema, an illustrated lecture.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? No? It's better now? Okay, let me start by wishing you a happy Pongal. And it is a joy to be back in Chennai, which has sort of become a second home for me here in India. This is the fourth time I've been to the Hindu Lit for Life Fest, and there's a reason I keep coming back, apart from the fact that they keep inviting me. This, of all the literary festivals I've attended, is the one that is most committed to opening the doors to ideas that travel across boundaries. And one of the things that I most appreciate about this festival at a time when spaces for public thought seem to be shrinking is that this is a redoubt, this is a bulwark, and all of you have to be thanked for that too. So today we're going to be crossing quite a few boundaries. Just to prove that I'm not entirely a North Indian Hindi chauvinist. So today I'm going to be trying to persuade you of a proposition that might seem to you absolutely counterintuitive. That if Shakespeare was alive today, he wouldn't be writing for the theatre, he'd be writing for the cinema. And he wouldn't be writing for Hollywood, he'd be writing for Bollywood. There's Shakespeare. There doesn't seem to be much that's Bollywood about him, right? Black, white, duh. Hardly the stuff of Bollywood, which is glitzy, colourful, pyar, nach, dishum. Apart from those abnormally large collars that Shakespeare and the Amitabh Bachchan figure seem to share, there doesn't really seem to be much common ground between Shakespeare and Bollywood. So, of course, we have to ask the question, how can Shakespeare possibly be Indian? But my point is, Shakespeare is Indian and has been Indian for a very, very long time. He's everywhere in India. Just go to Kolkata. There is a street, an area in downtown Kolkata, Shakespeare Sharani, that bears his name. But one can go beyond that to realize how much Shakespeare has permeated into everyday culture here, not least political culture, across the political spectrum. So many years ago, someone familiar with Shakespeare Sharani, the former president, Pranab Mukherjee, former Minister of Finance in the UPA government, when he released his budget one year, he said, "I must be cruel to be kind," which is a quote, of course, from Hamlet. Then that famous Shakespearean critic, Smriti Irani, formerly HRD minister, then Minister of Textiles, denounced her political opponents by saying they've got everything mixed up. Fair is foul and foul is fair for them. I'm not quite sure she realized that she was quoting Shakespeare's witches, but it kind of seemed appropriate in the scenario. And then on the far left, Sitaram Yechuri talking about a failure of the imagination in the Indian government to tackle problems of sanitation, also quoted Macbeth, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not remove the stain." But it's not just the political class. I could also mention a certain chief minister from Uttar Pradesh who seems to have fallen in love with Romeo, or anti-Romeo. But writers for a long time in India have been channeling Shakespeare, thinking with Shakespeare, working with Shakespeare's stories. Just two examples. Salman Rushdie, in his, I think, criminally underrated novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, works at length with Othello, the Moor of Venice. Anjum Hassan, who is here at this festival, in her marvelous book, Neti Neti, Not This, Not This, has an extended conversation with Hamlet. And there are many other examples I could name. Vikram Seth, if you've read A Suitable Boy, all 4,897 pages of it, you might remember a sequence in which there is an absolutely wonderful production of Twelfth Night. There are other marvelous reworkings of Shakespeare by Shaukat Majumdar, the Bengali novelist, in his book The Firebird. There's a production of Midsummer Night's Dream there. And most recently, an absolutely wonderful novel by Priti Taneja called We That Are Young, which is a reworking of King Lear in the context of Delhi, Punjab, and Kashmir. So Shakespeare has clearly grabbed English language writers' imaginations. But it's less in English Indian literature that we find Shakespeare than elsewhere. Because Shakespeare is arguably the biggest screenplay writer in Hindi cinema right now. And these 8 films that I've got up here just scratch the surface of a long engagement with Shakespeare. And it's not just Northern cinema, by the way. I need to keep reminding you and myself that I'm casting my net much wider than Bollywood in general. When we come to the South, there have been a sequence of reimaginings on film by Southern filmmakers of The Taming of the Shrew, Gundamakatha in Telugu, also remade in Kannada. A version was remade into Tamil, and for some reason it flopped here. But there have been many Tamil versions of Taming of the Shrew, 2 of which feature Shivaji Ganeshan. Aravali, from the early 60s, is a very loose reimagining of Taming of the Shrew. And more fascinatingly, featuring, at that time, a very important actress, Jaya Lalita, as the Katarina character, the Shrew character, again with Shivaji Ganesan. By this time, it's the early 70s, so long hair and really bad sunglasses are de rigueur. But this is, what is it? Parikara Paranama. Absolutely brilliant film. From Kerala, we find Jayaraj, the filmmaker, has engaged Shakespeare many times. 2 of his better-known Shakespeare productions are Veeram, a version of Macbeth, Kaliyattam, an absolutely inspired conversation with Othello. But in some ways, it all starts here, in Madras, as it was then called, in the 1940s with a production, it's described here as a comedy of errors with a romantic background, perfectly fitted to the heartbeat of human desire, Kani Katali. It's in fact not a version of Comedy of Errors, but of Twelfth Night. And interestingly, it featured someone named Madhuri Devi playing both the female and the male lead. Something that, of course, happened in Shakespeare's time as well, not with women playing men, but men playing women. That gives you some indication of how Shakespeare has not only spoken to creators of culture here, but elements of Indian culture have also found in Shakespeare something congenial. Now, it's very easy to say, because it is 90% true, that the reason Shakespeare is so popular in India is simply the legacy of British colonialism. And in particular, the legacy of one man, Thomas Macaulay, who, daunted by the prospect of colonizing a subcontinent that has so many rich cultural traditions, pronounced famously that, in fact, there is only one bookshelf in Europe that can surpass the entire cultural wealth of India and Asia. And what we need to do is create a cadre of Indians who are English-speaking, versed in English culture and literature, who will be able to basically quote Shakespeare in their sleep. Then we will have achieved the task of colonization. It's a rather chilling project, not least because it was so ingeniously and devilishly effective. India, believe it or not, was the first place in the world to teach Shakespeare in its universities. Less because people here were so brilliantly attuned to Shakespeare than because the colonial authorities supported this initiative. Long before Shakespeare was even taught in England, can you believe? By the mid-19th century, of course, everything that happens in India happens first in Bengal. It was at Presidency in Bengal, in Kolkata, that Shakespeare was first taught. But by the mid-19th century, students at Elphinstone College in Bombay were ritually expected to memorialize, to commit to rote memory entire passages from Shakespeare, a practice that I'm kind of ashamed to say continues to this day. Not because I don't think people should be reading, engaging with Shakespeare, but the practice of rote memory puts people in a position of docility in relation to what they're committing to memory. Now, the colonial machinery is partly responsible for why many of us know something about Shakespeare, but it cannot be held responsible for the deep love of Shakespeare throughout the subcontinent. There are other reasons, I think, why Shakespeare has sunk such deep roots here compared to, say, other English writers. And for me, that affinity between Shakespeare and the subcontinent and its cultural traditions has to do with one ingredient, literally one ingredient: masala. Now, what do we mean by masala? Westerners like me, long before I migrated to India, associated masala with simply spices. Every second restaurant Indian restaurant in New Zealand, where I grew up, there weren't many Indian restaurants there, but the ones I frequented, every second one was called something masala, masala kitchen, Mughlai masala, etc. So I associated masala with spices. It was only after I came to India that I realized masala had acquired this extra metaphorical dimension of something that you add to a story. Kahaniyan, masala ke saath, best kind of stories, with a little bit of embellishment or exaggeration. But of course, masala has a much more complex history of meaning than simply that latter metaphorical meaning. It comes from an Arabic word, masali, that migrated through Persian before ending up in the subcontinent. And masali in Arabic literally meant ingredient. And masala was a mix of ingredients. Masala means primarily mixture, at least for me. And it is the deep investment in mixture of the subcontinent and of Shakespeare as a playwright that I think has allowed Shakespeare's stories to acquire this extraordinary afterlife here. Now, Munshi Prem Chand, the great Hindi writer, he's a very interesting character because arguably, even though he's been canonized as a writer of Hindi, he is linguistically much more complex than that. And some of that complexity is indicated by his prescription for what makes a good story. He says the one vital ingredient that makes a good story, and a good novel in particular, is not plot, is not character, but is masala. And by that, he meant mixture. And he knew quite a bit about mixture, especially linguistically. Although he's called a Hindi writer, he started off writing in Urdu, in Nastaliq script. His stories were later translated into Hindi. He himself wrote in Hindi, but it's arguable that he wrote more accurately in that blended, mixed language that was called Hindustani for the longest time. Prem Chand was deeply invested in mixture, and it's not surprising, given that he was writing for an audience who spoke many, many languages, many, many bhashas. This is one of the things that has most enchanted me about India since I moved here many years ago. That language here is not a single track. I've been struck over and over again how a conversation may start in one language here, but will eventually swerve into another, and perhaps a third and a fourth before it finishes. And it meant, for me, that I had to give up a certain idea of Hindi that had been cooked into me when I was studying the language in the United States of America before moving here. Let me just tell you quickly a story about my bichari Hindi teacher. She was a migrant, a very congenial migrant from UP, who had moved to America some 40 years ago, and I don't think had been back once. And she was determined to teach her students a version of Hindi that no one has ever actually spoken, because it was systematically purged of any trace of Urdu, Arabic, anything Muslim. She made no bones about this. Every time we used a term that might be of foreign provenance, she said, "Bahut kharab hai," forgetting that the word kharab itself is a migrant from, yes. But anyway, this was the Hindi I learned, and in 2011, I came to Delhi, and I was feeling fairly proud of the small Hindi that I'd mastered. And I was in North Delhi, and I was looking for the library at the Delhi University. And I thought, let me try out my Hindi. So I walked up to a passerby and I said, "Mere mitra, कृपया बताइए पुस्तकालय कहाँ है?" And this guy looks at me and says, "Eh?" I repeated the question. He says, "Aap kahan se aate hain?" I said, "New Zealand," and then I repeated the question one more time, and he went, "Oh, library. बहुत बुरी हिंदी, huh? Jhalla tum." And that day I realized I had to unlearn all the deeply Sanskritized Hindi that my teacher taught me, and instead pick up something closer to what Prem Chand wrote in. Something that kept veering between Hindi and Urdu, and in the case of Delhi, Punjabi as well, a little bit of Bhojpuri. My students are my best educators here. One of them once said to me, "BT mat de yaar." I said, "BT kya hai? BT, how do you spell BT? BT? No, BT, acronym, bad trip. Bad trip mat de yaar." So this wonderfully impure yet creative language was something that struck me about the experience of people in North India, but it's also an experience I've encountered here too. People swerve between Tamil and English. In the case of my extended family, between Malayalam and Tamil and English. And this is an experience that I think most Indians have in some form. Even my driver speaks a Hindi that is full of English and Bengali, because that's where he's from. So, Hindi film has never been Hindi film in the purest should sense of Hindi. This much is apparent even from screen posters or title credit sequences. The iconic film Mother India, for instance, here is the poster, and you'll notice the title is in not one, not two, but three languages. Mother India, and there it is in Devanagari, and there it is in Nastaliq as well at the bottom. And this deep commitment to linguistic mixture is accompanied by all sorts of other mixtures that we find in the genre that has come to be called the masala movie. Now, many of us may associate masala with the really sublimely awful movies of Manmohan Desai and others in the late 70s and the 80s, with the most vacuous dialogue bazis, sexist one-liners, completely random plots, if they can even be called plots, pantomime villains, Magambo Kushwa. But I'd like to think of masala as referring not just to this one subgenre, but as describing an entire tradition. This is why I've invoked Prem Chand, that has characterized Hindi, i.e. Hindustani cinema, since its inception. Because even a film like Mother India, long before Manmohan Desai, mixes things up. It mixes things up in terms of genre. You have tragedy and comedy. Hindi films mix things up in terms of style. You have completely realistic dialogue coupled with song and dance routines that are about as unrealistic as you can get. It mixes up locations. A film that is set in Bombay suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, goes to Switzerland. It mixes up classes. It mixes up communities. And it had to mix things up because its audiences were always themselves mixed. And I got a sense of this for the first time in 2001. This was the very first time I'd watched a Hindi film, not on video in America, but in an Indian theater, in a single-screen cinema hall, the Chanakya Theatre in Delhi. It's been demolished, and unfortunately that demolition is, I think, a little bit symptomatic of what's happening with the idea of masala. But that day was a revelation for me. I hadn't known what to expect. I was going to see this film called Lagan. I had no idea what it was going to be. And I was absolutely astonished when I walked into the theater and realized this was far bigger than any movie theater I'd ever been to in New Zealand or England or the US. It seated about 1,500 people, but there were, of course, many other people beyond the 1,500 who had seats, crammed into the rows and the aisles. And so I was struck also by how the people sitting in the pits had paid a pittance to get in, whereas richer people were sitting in the balconies. And my idea of etiquette for an audience had to be thrown out the window. I was used to people sitting politely in the dark, pretending that they're not really there, that they're voyeuristically looking through a keyhole at a film. No, not in the Chanakya Theatre. From the moment Amir Khan appeared on screen, people were standing up, throwing coins at it. Amir, Amir! And I was also mesmerized by what I was seeing on screen. I'd never seen anything quite like it, even though I'd seen Hindi films on video before. But maybe it was something about the ambience of the theater itself. I realized that what was happening on screen was mirroring, albeit in a very distorted way, the mixture of the audience. The audience didn't come from one community. They were rich and poor, they were Hindu and Muslim and Sikh and Christian. And what were we seeing on screen? A cricket team being crafted out of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, even Dalit, coached by a woman. This was extraordinary. And then when Amir Khan, or rather Udit Narayan, singing for Amir Khan, sings, "O mitava, sun mitava, tujhko kya dar hai re, ye terti apni hai." That apni, I didn't understand it at the time, but upon subsequent viewing, I realized that apni was an extraordinary word, because ye terti belonged to everyone, not one community, not one religion, not one language. Even a culture shock Gora like me was included in that apni at that moment, at least emotionally. And the Masala movie, to this day, has something of that inclusiveness, that capaciousness. This is Ranbir and Madhuri at the beginning of Ye Javani Hai Diwani Hai. And it's interesting that even though the characters are middle-class Hindus, the soundtrack is, and it has extraordinary lyrics by Amitabh Bhattacharya, but they are drenched in Urdu. And this opening item number is in a sort of mock kota, a space that historically, conventionally, is associated with Muslims. There's something of this capaciousness that characterizes Masala films. But the Masala film, I think, is dying. And it's dying for a number of reasons. The emergence of the multiplex means that audiences are becoming much more homogeneous. But I also think that outside the cinema, mixture has become something that people are increasingly embarrassed by or find repugnant. I've noticed it amongst my students, no matter how bright, how progressive they are, I am often the native informant when I'm talking to them about Hindi cinema, because they have grown up on a diet of multiplex movies. Their preferences are for Hollywood, for European art house cinema. For them, a masala movie is a guilty pleasure. So, I mean, this is something that we can perhaps talk about more after I've finished talking with you. But I do think masala, in the way that Prem Chand understood it, is withering a little bit on the vine for a variety of economic, cultural, and political reasons. Now, what does this have to do with Shakespeare? Shakespeare is nothing if not masala. And this is something that is very easy for us to forget because most of us encounter Shakespeare in print, not on stage. And we've encountered Shakespeare in print in the high school system as sort of the equivalent of religious studies, something that we might not really want to do, but that we feel we have to do. Right? And as a result, we have acquired Shakespeare as high literature, as sacred scripture, rather than as something altogether more messy, more hybrid, more mixed. Remember, Shakespeare wrote his plays so that they could be heard, performed. We speak of audiences for a reason, because people went to hear Shakespeare's plays when they were first performed. Shakespeare's plays were, sorry, I'll just go back to my Shakespeare in drag. Shakespeare's plays were always written for a mixed audience. People paid 1 penny to stand in the pit. They paid 2 pennies to move up into a balcony. They paid a small fortune, £10, to sit on stage. But an entire cross-section of society was always present for a performance of a Shakespeare play. And Shakespeare had to take this into account as he wrote his plays. This is one reason why Shakespeare's plays, like Hindi films, involve both incredibly high poetry and earthy prose. This is something that people often forget. They think Shakespeare wrote only in poetry because he's a great artist, as if everything he said when he got up in the morning and said, "I want some breakfast," he'd say it in iambic pentameter. He didn't. He speaks the most colorfully purple galis throughout his plays, side by side with exquisitely crafted poetry. Generically, we're used to his plays being divided into tragedies and comedies, but there is no tragedy that doesn't contain comedy within it. Othello has a clown. King Lear has a clown. Macbeth has a porter who is a wise-cracking clown, who should be played by Nasruddin Shah. Even Hamlet himself is something of a jester. Little wonder that there's a wonderful adaptation of Hamlet in Bombay by Rajat Kapoor called Hamlet, the Clown Prince. The comedies are themselves mixed and contain many elements of tragedy. I defy anyone to tell me that The Merchant of Venice, classified as a comedy, doesn't have a profoundly tragic core, given what happens to Shylock the Jew in the course of that play. Ditto with Twelfth Night, or Comedy of Errors, or even A Midsummer Night's Dream. All these comedies are mixed. And they're mixed in a further sense that shocks many people. When I tell my Anglophone Indian friends how much I love Hindi cinema, many of them look at me askance and say, "Are, Gill bhai, what is this, yaar? You should know better. That Shakespeare. Hindi cinema's, Nach Gana. I say Shakespeare also is Nach Gana. It's a little-known fact, but every performance of a Shakespeare play would conclude with all the actors, even if the characters they played had been brutally murdered, springing up on stage and dancing what was called a burger mask. Song and dance was what the audience had come to see. They wanted it even in a fiercely tragic play. Romeo and Juliet involves a Nach Gana sequence right at the moment where Romeo and Juliet first fall in love. Shakespeare had item numbers. He had plenty of trees around which lovers dance. For instance, As You Like It is a play entirely about love in the forest. Midsummer Night's Dream, too. And many people say to me, well, at least, yeah, maybe there are all these commonalities, but Shakespeare was a genius who came up with these wonderful stories, whereas Hindi cinema is so derivative. Every story is unoriginal. Of Shakespeare's 37 surviving plays, 36 of them, he stole the stories. Right? You see, we get very hung up on the idea of great literature involving genius authors. I've no doubting that he's a genius. But he's, to use a metaphor that was used in an earlier session today, Shakespeare was not a genius in the sense of an owner of intellectual property. Shakespeare was a genius chef. A cook, every time he or she cooks, is working with a recipe that is familiar. If you cook something that no one has ever eaten before, people aren't going to want to eat it. They want familiar recipes, but they want masala added in new and creative ways to the familiar recipes. This is what Shakespeare was so good at, and this is what the best of Hindi cinema is so good at. Now, there's a long history of engagement with Shakespeare that again goes beyond Thomas Macaulay's remit. The Parsee theatre in Bombay represents this extraordinary tradition where the colonial Shakespeare and something from the ground met. The Parsee theatre included directors, actors who'd been educated at Elphinstone College in Bombay and had committed Shakespeare to memory. But they had also been exposed to local forms of entertainment like the Sangeet Natak. And the audiences for whom they performed their plays wanted song and dance, tragedy and comedy, high poetry and earthy prose. These audiences, like Shakespeare's first, were mixed. And it's no accident that the Parsee Sangeet Natak mined, amongst various sources, not only Kalidasa, but Shakespeare. We have counted something like 80 Parsee theatre adaptations of Shakespeare that were enormously popular with their audiences in the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century. And the Parsee theatre eventually morphed into the Bombay talkies. The very first Hindi films were filmed versions of Parsee plays, including the blockbuster play Khoon Ka Khoon, Blood for Blood, which was the Parsee director Saurabh Modi's version of Hamlet. Hamlet, performed in Urdu with Muslim characters by Parsee actors, in a company with a Sanskrit name. That gives you a sense of the extraordinary mix. Performing to an audience who spoke not only Hindi, Urdu, English, but also Marathi, Gujarati. Khoon Ka Khoon wasn't so much of a success as a film. Saurabh Modi was persuaded to rename all the characters their English names. So Jahangir, who was the hero of Khoon Ka Khoon, became Hamlet and had to wear Elizabethan costume. The film wasn't that successful, but Saurabh Modi was undeterred. His next film, Sayed-e-Havas, Story of Lust, was an adaptation of Shakespeare's little-known play, King John. It appeared in 1936. So there has been a long history of engagement with Shakespeare here in the Hindi cinema. 1981, Gulzar makes Angur. It's an adaptation of Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, but the thing that is most remarkable about it is what a generic Hindi film it is, about twins who have been separated, with screwball comedy involving a master and a servant, or rather, two sets of masters and servants. Knockabout fun as the wrong lovers are paired up with each other. Galis on the one hand, poetry on the other. Song and dance routines. All this Gulzar delivered to his audience, and they lapped it up because this is an audience familiar with Golmaal, with Amar, Akbar, Antony, also films about brothers being separated. This was an entirely Hindustani film, because it's in Hindi and Urdu, but it was also entirely Shakespeare. It's remarkable how seamlessly they come together. Many years later in Bombay, a terribly underrated film called 10 Mil Love. This is an adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream set in Bombay. The characters at the top, played by Rajat Kapoor and Tiska Chopra, are called Ghalib and Roshni. They're the Oberon and Titania characters. They're Muslim in this film. The lovers are Hindus, except for the one at the left, Peter, who is a Goan Christian. And the linguistic mix of the film is extraordinary. Ghalib speaks Urdu with a Bhojpuri dimension, Ho Javega. The love potion from Shakespeare becomes this extraordinary thing. I'm trying to remember the Urdu word for it. Does anyone here remember it? Sorry, I blanked on it. It's an Urdu word. But there are these wonderful exchanges where characters are speaking to each other in multiple languages. Ghalib meets Peter and calls him Mian Peter. And Peter says, very nice to meet you. Ghalib says, Zarur. Peter says, Vapas aaye. Ghalib says, Inshallah. All over the place, linguistically. But an audience sticks with it because they're used to swerving with language in their everyday speech. More famously, and I won't dwell on these, the brilliant Vishal Bharadwaj trilogy, Maqbool. You'll notice in the corner there the old masala tradition is observed. The title is in Devanagari and Nastaliq, as well as in Roman script. Not, interestingly, in the posters for Omkara and Haider. And most importantly, Romeo and Juliet. It's arguable that Hindi films could not exist without Romeo and Juliet. Here, just 6 examples, fairly recent, of Hindi Romeo and Juliet. Ishaqzaade, which I'm going to talk about more soon, involves a Hindu and a Muslim Romeo and Juliet. Ishaq, pretty unwatchable, involving poor Pratik Babar and his Juliet. They come from rival gangs in Uttar Pradesh, sand mafia gangs. The extraordinary film, Golion Ki Ras Leela Ram Leela by Sanjay Leela Bansali, set in Gujarat. Even though both this Romeo and Juliet are Hindu, it's hard not to see the shadow of Godra in this film, given its Gujarati setting. More recently, Dharak. It's an adaptation of a brilliant Marathi film called Sairat. Absolutely brilliant Marathi film called Sairat, which involves an intercaste Romeo and Juliet. In this Karan Johar version, the caste stuff gets... And this is one area in which Hindi cinema has not been admirable in its treatment of its recognition of caste. Punjabi adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, Jat and Juliet, involves an urban Punjabi Juliet and a rural, slightly Dahati Romeo. This being a Punjabi film, it has a happy ending. They go to Canada. And this was, by the way, the biggest blockbuster ever in Punjabi cinema. It generated something unprecedented, a sequel. Jat and Juliet 2. If you ever wondered what happened to Romeo and Juliet once they survived that unfortunate incident in the tomb and later decided to become policemen and play kinky games with handcuffs and truncheons, go and see Jat and Juliet 2. But I'm going to dwell with Romeo and Juliet for a bit because I think this is a particularly instructive play for thinking about Hindi cinema and masala. And I'm going to dwell just briefly on something that we may all associate with Shakespeare, but which I think comes right back home to us here in the subcontinent, and that's the pun. Romeo and Juliet is a play absolutely full of puns. This irritates a lot of people, particularly my students. They want things to be clear. And Shakespeare notoriously resists clarity because he is constantly playing with words, twisting them, turning them upside down. The most famous example is when Mercutio, Romeo's best friend, is stabbed during a brawl between the two rival families, the Montagues and the Capulets. He says to Romeo, "Ask for me tomorrow, and you will find me a grave man." And there's a pun on grave here. I'll be serious tomorrow, but also I'll be under a grave. Now, the thing that interests me about this pun is that Shakespeare couldn't have produced it if he didn't live in a multilingual society. You may say, what? Shakespeare was English. He wrote in English. In a way, yes, because the language that Shakespeare has given us, we have come to call English. But in fact, what he wrote in had not yet been standardized as English. What he wrote in was a kitchery of many dialects and languages because his audience was mixed. And his language consisted of elements of Anglo-Saxon, a Germanic language, elements of French, because of the Norman conquerors. The aristocracy for many centuries had spoken French, even considered themselves French. Latin, which was the language of the church, and languages spoken by migrants. There were a lot of Italian migrants, tradesmen, for instance, in London. Grave comes from French, grave, meaning serious. But grave, in another sense, comes from the German grab, meaning to dig. So a burial grave is Germanic. It comes from digging up the ground. To be a grave person is French, to be serious, all right? So this pun points to something masala in Shakespeare's language, in his audience. That his audience would get the pun is also significant. That they too, like you, were used to swerving between different dialects. Now, the beginning of Romeo and Juliet is extraordinary. It starts with 4 lines that no one remembers nowadays because they're focused simply on the love story between Romeo and Juliet. But these opening 4 lines are a little bit like an item number in a Hindi film. They involve 2 characters who we'll never see again, who are using their bodies on stage, except these guys are gangsters, right? They're gangsters from Juliet's family, the Capulet clan, and they're talking about what they're going to do if they run into thugs from the other family, the Montagues. Samson, big Samson, says, Gregory, on my word, we'll not carry coals. Gregory, no, for then we should be colliers. Samson, I mean, if we be in choler, we'll draw. Gregory, aye, while you live, draw your neck out of the choler. 4 puns on the sound coal in 4 lines. Normally my students go, yeah, whatever. Get on to the love bit. Like an item number, what seems extraneous is actually commenting on what's to come. Item numbers, I think, are for me often the most interesting parts of movies because they contain a lot of the thought of the movie distilled lyrically into a song. Now, what on earth does this mean? Samson is saying, we'll not carry coals, we'll not put up with insults. In modern American speak, yo, no one's going to diss us, bro. All right? Gregory, for no, then we should be colliers. Colliers means carries a coal. You know, he's that smart aleck who's saying, ha, 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 yeah, no one's going to diss us because then we'd be carrying coal, and that'd be pretty stupid. We're high-class people. Samson, I mean, if we be in choler, we'll draw. Choler means to be angry, right? If I'm angry, I'll draw. And he doesn't mean draw with, you know, pencil or crayon. He means I'll draw my sword. I'll pop a cap in his butt, right? Gregory, responding to his gangster rapper friend, I, while you live, draw your neck out of the collar. Collar, not Shakespeare or Amitabh Bachchan's collar, but collar in the sense of noose. Don't do anything that's going to get you killed, mate, he's saying. So 4 lines, 4 puns, and interestingly, all these coal puns, they come from 4 different languages. Coal from German coal, collier from French collier, collar from Latin coller, color from the Italian collare. The audience gets all these because just like you, they can swerve between these dialects. But what interests me is that this is subliminally setting the scene for a story of forbidden love between clans that shouldn't hook up. Proponents of purity, of Shuddha, would say that German and French shouldn't hook up. They're totally different languages, right? Italian and Latin, you know, the Pope might live in the Vatican, which is surrounded by Rome, but Latin and Italian, totally different languages. They shouldn't be mixed. Yet, in this opening sequence, they do mix. Latin, Italian, French, German all hook up and create this wonderfully creative, exhilarating wordplay. That subliminally creates the preconditions for a play that is all about people from clans who shouldn't hook up, hooking up, because love, like language, refuses boundaries. What can be more masala? What can be more masala So I want to wrap up by talking about what for me was an extraordinary film, Ishaqzaade. How many of you have seen Ishaqzaade? This is great. This is a kind of version of Romeo and Juliet set in UP. I was amazed when I was watching it. I hadn't realized it was a version of Romeo and Juliet. The Shakespearean in me sat up when I realized, my God, we have a Hindu Romeo, who's the son of a sort of gangster political family, and a Muslim Juliet, the daughter of a gangster political family, rival clans. They get together against the odds. They end up dying. It's a tragedy. At the very beginning of the film, there is an extraordinary item number. It was extraordinary for me because it took me back to that conversation in the Pustakalai affair many years ago, where that guy told me, Jhalla Tum. This is a song called Jhalla Valla. It appears in a Hindi film. I want you to listen to it and tell me what language is it in really. Can the people up at the console start this video for us, please? I'm not going to show you the visuals because I don't want you to be distracted. I want you to concentrate on the words. The lyrics are written by Kausar Munir, who I think is Bollywood Shakespeare. See? Shakespearean.
जिसका ना जिगर पे लगाए चोट, जिसके जाने से बम फटे, एटम बम हो जाए विस्फोट, आशिकों की है शामत या फत है, चांद बेबी है आई कयामत है। आशिकों में जिसका टाइटल टाइटैनिक, ओ आशिकों में जिसका टाइटल टाइटैनिक, मुआ किनारा दिखा कर डुबा दे गया। झल्ला मेरा आशिक झल्ला बल्ला, मेरा बलमा झल्ला बल्ला, मेरा झल्ला बल्ला बल्ला।
I know. I want it. I could play this all day long, and I would, but I've been told by the trustworthy timekeepers that we don't have that much time left. But what language is this in? Hindi? Urdu? Yes? English? There's also Persian in it, there's Arabic in it, it's all over the place. I've put up some of the lyrics here and given you my rather bad translation. But what you'll notice is it's full of puns. There's title, Titanic, that's within English. But there, later in the song, the part that I didn't play to you, there's a wonderful line about the teacher who is a fa-teacher. That's a cross-lingual pun. It's cultures who are exposed to many languages that are the most punning cultures because they are used to a word from one language sounding exactly like the word from another language that means something completely different. And this song is full of that. It's a song that seems to have, on the surface, no connection to the rest of the film. But like the opening of Romeo and Juliet, it is subliminally laying the scene for a tale of love between a Hindu and a Muslim. Because we see language promiscuously interacting here. What is normally considered Hindu language is in bed, as it were, with language for what my bichari Hindi teacher would have been absolutely shocked by. She would have put her hands over my ears listening to this. And so this song sets the scene for a tale of love between a Hindu and Muslim, quite beautifully. But it's doing more than that. I think it is also inviting its audience into a masala universe where all these rigid boundaries need to be traversed. They're boundaries of the imagination as much as of community and clan. This is why I believe that not only is India a wonderful receptacle for these new adaptations of Shakespeare, but that masala can help us reread Shakespeare. It can help us retrieve elements of Shakespeare that we have forgotten to read through the Macaulayan lens that colonialism has given us. It allows us to think capaciously and imaginatively against the injunctions to shuddhata that we're hearing every day now from above and around us, whether it's the guardians of caste purity, whether it's the guardians of linguistic purity. As I said, I don't want to be a northern chauvinist. I have not come here to say Hindi is the national language. Far from it. I'm so glad that there are fierce holdouts to the idea of Hindi as the national bhasha. But I think the Hindi of Hindi cinema is fascinating precisely because it itself resists the idea of a pure language. It encourages us to think across boundaries so that we can begin to think that a playwright from 1590 from a small backwater island in Europe that is about to become even more backwater on May 29th might cross a boundary and find a comfortable home here in India. A Farangi can become Desi, after all. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? No. We got for 2 questions? TK. We got time for 2 questions, and I really want to, can I say something a little bit prescriptive here? Every time people say questions, 10 men jump up like this. I really want to hear female voices as well. One of the things I love about Jalla Valla is not only is it a woman singing, but it is so wonderfully irreverent to the idea that a man can be this Romeo in the Indian sense of a Romeo who can sweep her off her feet. Teacher becomes for teacher. So please, women, I will welcome your interventions. It's not stopping the men from... Okay, where are the people with the mics? Yes, yes, here. In yellow here. Can the mic give us, please? You heard what I said, so I'm going to observe that. Thank you.
Hello. If Shakespeare had been alive today, do you think he would have used Hindi words and Bollywood dancers and stuff in his place?
How could he not have? But he would have not just used Hindi, he would have used Urdu, he would have used Punjabi. If he was based in Chennai, he would have used Tamil, he would have used...
And the dances?
Of course, because his plays are full of dancing routines, as I was talking about before. Shakespeare is a purveyor of Nach Gana. And don't let people convince you otherwise. Shakespeare is as cheap and B grade as you can get, but he is also as expensive and A grade as you can get, and that is the beauty of Shakespeare. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Sir, actually, Romeo and Juliet has written in Tamil 400 years ago called Madurai Veera, and nobody knows it. And there is a play called Ambikavati Amaravati, which is 300 years old. That is exactly Romeo and Juliet.
Well, something I'd just say about the story of Romeo and Juliet is that it's not Shakespeare's story, right? We're so hung up on this. Oh, Shakespeare, he invented Romeo and Juliet. He didn't. He found the story somewhere else. I've said Shakespeare's a chef. He cooked up a new version of Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps more accurately, he's a kabaddi wala. He found all these discards. And in the case of Romeo and Juliet, we can trace its origins back. It's got a very plural genealogy. You go back thousands of years. There's a story called Pyramus Thisbe, which Ovid wrote about. It's actually a Babylonian tale. He wrote about it in his Metamorphoses. Shakespeare adapted that for Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's basically the story of Romeo and Juliet. It morphed into Romeo and Juliet in Italy in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. It migrated east, this Babylonian story, and became the tale of Laila and Manjun. They're mentioned, by the way. Even if they were historical figures, the narrative precedes them. And historical figures get slotted into pre-existing narratives. Just look at all the anti-Romeos and anti-Juliets we have in Uttar Pradesh right now. So remember, stories are travelers. Shakespeare doesn't have copyright on them. These Tamil Romeo and Juliets, I think, are part. For all I know, they're entirely indigenous, but I think it's highly likely that stories that cropped up here are stories that cropped up in conversation with other storytellers. It's the nature of stories to travel, no matter how much we try and tie them down and say they belong to us and us alone. Right? Sab Kuch Hain, one more question? Yes, here.
Moment to Google. 10 ml love, the potion is called Joshe Javani.
Joshe Javani, thank you. Yes.
I know Angur and Makbul, Omkara and Haider do acknowledge Shakespeare. The other
Yes. Golion Ki Raslila Ramlila says based on William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. But there are a number of Shakespeare adaptations that don't acknowledge, and it doesn't mean that they are in breach of copyright. Actually, one of the things that I think is so interesting about a film like Ishaqzaade is the vast majority of the audience would never know it was Shakespeare. They wouldn't even know who Shakespeare is. And in a way, it doesn't matter. But what they have done by buying the ticket to Ishaqzaade is open up to the possibility of being in a universe where we see something that is simultaneously Shakespearean and simultaneously masala. I really want to exonerate masala. We often use masala in this derogatory way. It's just masala. Masala, for me, is one of the most beautiful things, the most beautiful ways of thinking, one of the most beautiful ways of being. It's a universe of possibility, of thinking against boundaries, thinking against rigid identities. We don't need to know Shakespeare in order to enter into that universe. But it helps if we recognize that Shakespeare, in conjunction with masala, gives us a glimpse of what that universe can look like. Thank you very much.